Let me share with you a story about the doctor who saved my wife. And here's the thing, and I've written about this and attached it below if you haven't seen it. It was actually one of the most read articles that I've written on Medium. And by the way, that is not saying much, but that is one of the most read articles on Medium for me. And Luis actually came to me as a handyman, as a maintenance man. So when I worked in Glendale, in the Glendale office for the first company I worked for, Safeco Insurance, most people know that by now, I was a unit manager responsible for a whole bunch of things: claims administration, administrative functions for other departments. I had the facilities management, which meant company cars, HVAC complaints, the whole 9 yards. I had a great boss who worked in HR and another great boss. I had two bosses. The other boss worked in Fountain Valley. They were both phenomenal people. But I had to hire a maintenance guy, and we originally got this guy as a temp, and his name was Luis. I cannot for the life of me remember his last name, and this is over 20 years ago. But Luis, as I mentioned in the article, this is not hyperbole. He was one of the hardest working people I have ever met in my life. In fact, he's probably the hardest working person I have ever met. If you asked him to do something, he would spring out of his chair and run and go do it. That is not an overstatement. That is how he carried himself. And he was always looking for things to do. But you have to keep in mind, he's a maintenance man. Everyone, he is not making a ton of money doing this, right? And you would never see him dawdling and talking to people. It's just not what he did. I mean, if he was talking, he was probably talking to me or a few other friends. But generally speaking, Luis was always working. He was so efficient. In fact, I was worried that I was going to run out of things for him to do. But here's the thing. So at around the same time I hired Luis, and he had been working for about 3 or 4 months, I think, at this time, my wife suffered a real personal illness that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'll just tell you this. It was 5 months after she had delivered our first child, and she was sick and weak. She was losing weight, and she did not have a lot of weight to lose to begin with. And we went to the very first doctor we went to. I don't want to be too harsh, but she was almost a quack. She told my wife it was in her head, but she still suggested we go to a specialist. So we went to a specialist. The specialist said, okay, something's wrong here. Here's what I'm going to prescribe for you. And she took that. It did not work, right? And so my wife was beginning to get desperate. And of course, we would keep going through the medical system, but I also thought, since my wife, if you don't know, she was born in the United States, but she was raised in Mexico. She was very familiar with Mexican doctors, number one. But number two, she understood different forms of medicine. But Luis was a medical doctor. He had been trained in Mexico, near Mexico City, and he had been a doctor for years. And I knew that. The only reason he wasn't working as a doctor is because he had just come to the United States. He hadn't had a chance to take the boards, right? So I came to him one day and I said, Luis, I have a sensitive subject to talk to you about. Let's go outside. So I explained the problem to him, and he was taking it in, right? The typical, listening to me. And I said, can you come and see her? And he did. So that night he came to our house. Now, what was interesting about this is that Luis, you remember how you see people in a specific light because of their uniform, right? And literally, he wore a uniform, and that's how I saw Luis. So he comes to my house, and he's taken a shower. He's put on new clothes, and he has a completely different bearing. And keep in mind, this man was one of the most egoless people I have ever met in my life. And so when he showed up at my door, I'm like, holy cow! But now I feel like like to bow to him. He comes in. He sits next to my wife after washing his hands, and he proceeds to examine her, right? And so he spent probably 5 to 10 minutes examining her, asking her different questions, and he finally said, I think you have an amoeba. And so that was startling, right? So if you've ever traveled overseas, that may happen. You don't typically see it in the United States. I'm not saying that you can't. I'm not even sure how my wife got it. But this was not a surprise to my wife, but it was a huge relief. So we ended up getting medicine for her that helped her out. And frankly, she got better almost immediately. And I cannot tell you what a relief it was, because we could not find a cure for this. So look, this is an emotional story for me. It's a heart-rending story for me, but it's a real positive story as well. But it's also a story about appearances, right? And it's also an interesting story about how you approach work. Because think about it. Luis was a doctor, but he worked as a maintenance man like it was the most important job in the world. He was phenomenal at it. He's like the Michael Jordan or the Michael Phelps of maintenance men. I know that's an overstatement, but that's how good he was. He did not have an ego. And the other thing, and I mentioned this in the story, he would lose himself in his work. He would lose himself so much that when he came back, he was sweating. But it was almost like he was in a trance. That was the power of his mind and his focus. And so as a doctor, I can only imagine what became of him. By the way, if you ask me, I don't know. I have not been able to find him. So the question for you is, and if you're sharing this with your teams, have you ever encountered somebody like that? And by the way, there's no titles, no hierarchy. You can find greatness in any job. But the interesting here is the contrast between working as a maintenance man and being qualified to perform doctor duties and being able to save somebody's life. It's pretty incredible. So I hope that's an inspiring story for you, and I hope it provokes questions, because as I asked you before, have you ever encountered somebody like this in your life, and how did they inspire you? Thanks for stopping by. Again, welcome to the Motivation Lab.